It's me, Nadia, and welcome to Free My Mojo podcast number 39. And today we are talking about disrupt their narrative. The rest of your story is unwritten still. This way is a very important one because many of us are aware or unaware that we are living in a story. In other words, we live in a story about who we are, where we came from, who our family are. We live in a story of what we're capable of, what we've done already. We are our resume, so to speak, or our CV. So we live in a narrative. And then there's all kinds of layers to that narrative. There's the layer of our origin, where we come from. There's the layer of how much we're worth or what our profession is or what do you do. It's one of the most common questions adults will say to other adults that they just met. Oh, what do you do? As if that somehow defines us. So in asking you to look at the narrative, we're asking you to look at what is the story of your life and what is the narrative that you're living in. For example, your race or your ethnicity or where you're from or what you do. There's a certain story or narrative that goes along with this. So this is a really powerful moment to say to yourself, you know what? Yeah, there's been a narrative up until now, but that narrative is really just a springboard of where I've come from. That narrative up until now is not the whole story. And then the other way to look at that is, yes, there are narratives around certain things. For example, there's a narrative around the environment, or there's a narrative around love, or there's a narrative around all kinds of things, art and what it means. And we are now in a situation of saying, that narrative is too small for me. That narrative is not broad enough for me. There is much more to me and to my world than this narrative. One of the things that's fascinating to me is my youngest son is really interested in space. So we frequently read books about space. And it never fails to amaze me how enormous a galaxy is. And it never fails to amaze me how big the universe is and what there is going on in the universe and how many billions of years or millions of years things are happening, and that the sun is really kind of a shabby star compared to a lot of the other ones. And obviously it's such a huge deal to us on our little planet. So the narrative that we live in, the size of the narrative, the size of the impact of the narrative is really important. And it's really important that we keep on reinvesting ourselves in new narratives, listening to new stories, opening ourselves up to new ideas. How we do that, it doesn't really matter. For example, maybe you are someone who enjoys listening to podcasts, hopefully so. Podcasts are a great way to explore narrative. Documentaries are a great way. All kinds of ways that you can expand listening to different people's stories or narratives in the form of TED Talks or hearing them speak in public or going to situations where you can meet other people. But in really listening to the narratives that are going on around us, the one we have to be very careful of is the internal narrative, the narrative in our head, that might be too small. And maybe it's the narrative of the people closest to us as well. Maybe be that partners or parents or friends or associates or former people in our lives, people who've got commentary on us, people who think they know us, people who want to define us or limit us. So disrupting the narrative is a really powerful phrase. And I love this phrase. And to me, it's very important because I know that I spent decades of my life continuing in the narrative because I felt that narrative was the narrative I was supposed to live in, and that narrative was the narrative that all women of my age or whatever my story was, that I was living in a story and that story was limited and that I had to somehow just comply with that narrative. So what we're asking you to do here in this way is to really take a look at the fact that the rest of your story is still unwritten. That there may be another chapter here that is completely different than the chapters so far. And one of the things that we have to realize is that in disrupting the narrative, And in looking at the ways our story is unwritten, there's that wonderful song, Unwritten. And you think about the ways in which your story is still unwritten. There are other paragraphs, there are other storylines, there are other characters that are going to come in. And that this is not the end of the narrative. The narrative is not over, not about anything. That the narrative can be revisited. So whatever narrative has limited you in some capacity as a person, as a creative, as a business person, as a parent, as a loved one, there is another side to this narrative. There is another option. There is another way to see this. And if it's unwritten, then that's really exciting because you are co-creating your destiny. Your destiny is not written in some book somewhere and you're just fulfilling that. You know, we know more than that. We know better than that. We know that your consequences re-navigate your situation. So when we look at this disruption, it doesn't have to be obnoxious. We don't have to blow everything up. It doesn't even have to be that we tell people that we're disrupting the narrative. We just go about it and we just do it. And we do it in our own way. In many ways, the little book, 52 Ways to Free My Mojo, was my disruption. It was my creative grenade that I wanted to throw into the world to help liberate creative energy for people. Because I remember a few years before I wrote the book, I remember reading a book called Escape from Cubicle Nation. And I remember how I read that book and I listened to all these stories of people who had been very stuck in corporate living or very stuck in a role. And I really said to myself, my soul feels like it's dying on the vine here. Like I really have to recreate myself in a new way. And that was a major disruption. And I actually remember the day when I thought about not teaching college anymore because I had taught college for 18 years. And this little voice said, well, what will you be if you're not Professor Ramoutar anymore? And I remember saying, who said that? Who's asking that question? Where is that question coming from? Because in many ways, that question is coming from my ego, isn't it? If I'm not going to be a college professor, if everybody's not going to have to treat me with respect and ask me if they can leave class early or ask me if they can turn in their work late or can they get a better grade, if people aren't coming to me in this power relationship, then what is my purpose? What do I do? How do I serve the world? How am I valued in the world? Right? So I was living a narrative. The narrative was get as much education as you can. I got a PhD and now I was a college professor and now I felt like that brought me certain things and I needed to be able to fulfill that narrative until one day I said, I really don't want to do this anymore. And then the little voice said, so what are you going to do if you're not going to be looked up to, if you're not going to have this title and this role? So we have to be careful because that little ego, that little smallness within us sometimes keeps us very, very tight, very, very small. So what we really want to look at is how we can expand ourselves to totally disrupt the narrative. The realization that we are living in a story, that we are living in a narrative, and that that narrative may not be our narrative. We may not have been the ones who wrote that narrative. We may not be the ones who created that storyline or made those decisions that made that narrative possible. And the idea that we don't have to continue on with that narrative, that the rest of the narrative can be rewritten and that we can be the ones to rewrite it, that is an extremely powerful realization that the narrative may or may not be true for us and that the rest of the narrative may or may not be true for us and that we don't have to fear the narrative because the narrative can be disrupted and we can be the ones to disrupt the parts of the narrative that we have outgrown or that we don't love or that doesn't serve us anymore, and that we can find a way to retell our story and we can find a way to co-create and to co-collaborate to change the story. For example, if something horrific has happened to us or something difficult has happened to us and we've been living in the pain of that narrative, we can get out of the victim side of this narrative and move into the advocacy side of this narrative and move away from the limitations of the old narrative. So this is very powerful because we have to realize that throughout time, history has been written down by the victors, and the victors frequently did not respect or regard the rights of all the people on the path. So we don't have to be subjected to that. We don't have to be written out of our own story. We can decide that we want a different reality and a different outcome. And we can make that happen by embracing the unwrittenness of our own future and our own story, and even our own presence right now here in this narrative and what that narrative is. So I encourage you to look at what you're dealing with and look at what stories you're telling about yourself and look at what story you're buying into about the future, and make very, very sure that that is the story you want to keep living. Thank you so much for joining me. And one of the exercises I encourage is to write a letter to your future self. This may sound a little funny or weird or odd, but in creating a vision, in creating a vision board or an art sketchbook, or in creating a letter to your future self, you are inviting a new narrative. You are opening the door to a new narrative. Here in Ireland, one of my favorite words is the word for threshold, on Taoiseach, and it's about crossing over that threshold into what's new and in disrupting that old narrative. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate this opportunity to share some stories with you and to encourage you to write your next story. Thank you.